I'm honored to welcome Regan Reeder, who is the Vice President of Care and Connections. Regan loves helping families that are experiencing tough times. She's always had a heart for caring for individuals with various needs, earning 2 degrees in elementary education and special education at Cedarville University. Regan also earned her Master's of Education in Special Education from Slippery Rock University. As a part-time staff member for Pressing On, Regan spends most of her time connecting with families, providing helpful resources and encouraging them in the midst of their pain. As a mom who's experienced her daughter's long road to recovery from liver transplant, she's passionate about linking families to one another in order to cope with their ongoing needs. Regan also serves as the Senior Special Education Consultant for Pressing On. In her spare time, she can be found reading Jen Karen's Mitford series, watching the Hallmark Channel, coaching other women in leadership, and enjoying time with her girls. Richie Reeder is the Executive Director for Pressing On. Richie provides vision, oversight, and leadership for the entire organization. His daily responsibilities range from strategic planning and administration to donor communication and fundraising, to social media and marketing, to coordinating ongoing Pressing On initiatives and events. Richie earned his Bachelor's of Administration, his BA in Comprehensive Communications from Cedarville University and his MDiv from Rockbridge Seminary. He enjoys public speaking and various opportunities to communicate the vision for Pressing On. Having spent much time in the hospital caring for his youngest daughter, losing his dad to cancer as a young adult, and caring for families while coordinating funerals, Richie is passionate about using his personal experience to encourage, challenge, and coach other families to persevere in the midst of their crisis. In his spare time, he can be found keeping up with the Pittsburgh sports and following along closely with Penn State athletics. Richie is fond of his bobblehead collection and is also an avid fan of The Office. We also have Dr. Beth Logan, who is a pediatric psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital. Now let's begin with Richie and Regan Reeder.
Excellent. Thank you, Stacy, for the introduction. This session is entitled Persevering as a Family Through the Transplant Process, something that Regan and I are very passionate about as transplant parents. And we look forward to getting to know each of you. But our goal today is simply to talk through and identify some challenges that every transplant family faces, and also share some helpful and holistic tips to navigate that journey, and simply to remind transplant families that you are not alone, that while every situation is different and we would never say that we understand every situation, we have walked that walk, and we're very passionate about sharing holistic ideas to help couples, to help families, to help extended families, to help individuals persevere during the transplant process. And maybe you're like us. We have called the transplant process a roller coaster, right? That there are many ups and many downs. And so you ride the waves and you celebrate the joys and you grieve the losses. And it is definitely a difficult journey that we can resonate with. And so we want to introduce ourselves, Richie and Regan Reeder, as Stacy just noted. I like to say that the best thing about me is my 3 leading ladies, my wife, Regan, who's sharing the screen with me right now. We've been married for 15 years, all of those years in the wonderful city of Pittsburgh. We love our city, and we've been here for a while, and we hope to live here for a very long time. We founded a nonprofit called Pressing On, which is a 501c3 organization that serves hospitalized families, specifically those affected by rare disease and those that are affected by long-term hospitalizations, including transplant. And so our daughter, Olivia, is age 10, and our daughter, Micah, whom Regan will speak about in a moment, is age 7. And she's been diagnosed with a rare genetic disease that some of you may be familiar with, methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short. And she received her life-saving liver transplant in 2017. So here's a picture of our family on vacation in Florida last year. We were blessed to be able to get out and see a little bit of the country last summer after being vaccinated. And Olivia is 10. And when she was 9, I used to say that she was 9 going on 19. So if you've got a 10-year-old, you know that the eye rolls have started to come. We're thankful that Olivia is very healthy, but she started to roll her eyes at mom and dad because
preteen now.
She knows everything. Yeah. And then the most famous member of our family, Micah Joy, is down there at the bottom of the photo. She is 7. She's in kindergarten. And just like I asked her a couple of weeks ago, if you asked her what her favorite courses are or classes are, she would tell you lunch and recess at kindergarten. So she's thriving right now. And Regan, why don't you share a little bit about our transplant journey?
Sure.
Just real quickly before Regan shares a little bit about our transplant journey, we want to answer the question why, or so what? Why is this topic of perseverance during the transplant process important? Why is this topic timely, and why is it needed? As many of you know, there's many stresses that we deal with as transplant families throughout the process. And studies have shown that parents of children with genetically based diseases have a higher than 70% divorce rate. We've also seen that psychological distress from parents is acutely affected in the hospital. And that psychological distress can negatively affect child outcomes in that transplant process. 84% of families face financial difficulty while they're hospitalized, and family members have been reported to give priority to the welfare of their ill relative, and in their heightened emotional state have often adversely put their own health at risk. And so there's many stresses and traumas that result in fractured relationships. We've not just experienced these personally, but the data backs that up as well. And so, yes, the transplant itself affects the patient, but we want to represent a holistic approach and understand that transplant and the long journey before, during, and after transplant affects the whole family.
So just a little bit about our transplant journey. This is our Micah Joy there in the middle. That was within a year or so after her transplant. She received her liver transplant just before her second birthday. So I'll tell you a little bit about our journey. We have a healthy 10-year-old, Olivia. We did not know we were genetic carriers. We call ourselves the genetic jackpot, and we were carriers for a rare disease. But Micah was born after a full-term uncomplicated pregnancy. We had no idea that anything was going to happen, but she went into a severe metabolic crisis on day 3 of her life. She was transferred from our local hospital to Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, where she was put on dialysis and diagnosed with methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA. That week was obviously crazy, but they started discussing liver transplantation as the most effective treatment option for MMA. And given the fact that Pittsburgh is one of the leading transplant centers in the country for liver transplant, we were really grateful that we were able to list her for transplant at a center close to home for us. We listed her in July of 2016, and after 4 calls, her 4th call was the one where she received her liver on 1/7/17. And to say that the first 2 months after transplant were complicated is an understatement. She had many very serious complications following transplant and spent a month in the PICU, and just many complications that followed, especially the first year. But we are grateful to report that Micah is over 5 years post-transplant now. And it really felt like in many moments we would never get our heads above water. So that might be where some of you are right now, or what you're headed into. And we understand the fear that is associated with the process. She is now looking forward to her big kindergarten graduation on June 1st. And we know she'll be flaunting her stuff on the stage of our high school in her graduation. Also, like Richie said, a few years after transplant, we founded Pressing On as a 501c3 nonprofit to give back to others in similar situations that we have found ourselves in. We'll talk about the importance of holistic health and our view on that, and how we incorporate that into every aspect of our nonprofit as we share a little bit more. But just to transition into what we're going to speak on, we just want you to know up front, we're not speaking because we have it all figured out or because we did everything right. We have and continue to have struggles in our marriage and in our family because chronic illness is difficult. And so we just come at you very humbly to say that we're in it with you and learning as we go, and hope that maybe a few things we've picked up along the way are an encouragement and a help to you wherever you find yourself in, whether that is married or separated or divorced or with other siblings or not with other siblings. We know that family dynamics are a tough aspect of the transplant process. So we will go ahead and move on to our next slide. Just we're brainstorming, some potential issues during transplant. So I'll let you share those.
Yeah. So I'm sure that if you've been affected by transplant, whether you're on the waiting list or you're considering transplant or you're in the midst of it right now or your child is post-transplant, I'm sure that you can resonate with some of these. But here are some potential family issues that we have experienced during transplant, and I'm sure that maybe a few of these you might resonate with. One simply is communication. Maybe you didn't know this, but only 7% of our communication is communicated verbally. 93% of it is communicated non-verbally. And so our attitudes, our postures, the innuendo of how we speak to one another, maybe the anger or bitterness or the grieving process that we're going through comes out in our language, even if it seems respectful. So communication with our partner, with our spouse, other kids, extended family, your social network. We've found that everyone wants the best for our daughter during her transplant process, but everyone also wants resolution. And if you've walked the journey of transplant, you know that so many people mean well, but they can actually say some hurtful things
Like,
during
is
the
she
transplant.
better yet?
Yeah, is she better yet? Or things are good, right? We remind people all the time that home doesn't necessarily equal healed. If you're a transplant family, much respect to you as you're dosing those immunosuppressant medications and the many medications that you have to give your child at home. But we'll dive into communication a little bit later. How about caregiver and work balance? Balancing being a parent, but also an employee. I think all of us would say if we had to choose our job or our child, we obviously would choose our child. We want the best for them. And we would, we wish that we could be the one on the operating table. But sometimes there's some stresses there regarding work responsibilities that are needing to be done while we are in the process of caring for our child. You want to take the next one?
Yeah. So personal physical health, things like nutrition and exercise and sleep. We all respond to stress differently. Richie wanted to eat a burger after transplant, and I felt sick to my stomach for 2 months.
Maybe you're like me and you eat everything in sight when you're affected by stress and trauma, or maybe you're like Regan and you forget to eat.
Yeah.
Consider which one you are right now. But the fact of the matter is that our personal physical health is affected while we're caring for our loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also financial stress regarding healthcare bills, insurance, filing FMLA paperwork with our places of employment. All of those things don't just get figured out just because we're in the hospital and we have some good social workers or we have some good HR reps at our place of employment. They take a lot of time and effort and intentionality, and filling out a lot of paperwork regarding finances can be stressful.
Yeah.
You can take the next one.
Yeah, community and relationships. There's a lot of people that mean well, but you're still trying to balance all of that. The different relationships you have on top of new information. You're keeping up with this overload of medical information and medical jargon and what home care is going to look like, and you can't even picture what your quote unquote new normal is going to look like. So yeah, it's all a struggle for sure.
And you've probably resonated with as well the fact that it's tough to keep up with people. Prioritizing relationships in the midst of a long-term hospitalization is definitely tough. So we promise that we're not just going to identify challenges. We're going to point out some tips and some hopeful solutions. But those are a few of the potential family issues. We want to remind everyone, and this is something that we've learned along the way, that we are not one-dimensional human beings, that we are complicated human beings, that there are layers and there are different parts and components of who we are. And we like to say at Pressing On that we are five-fold individuals, that there's 5 parts that make up who we are as individual. And it's important for us to keep these parts in mind as we assess our holistic needs while we're faced with trauma and a long-term hospitalization in the transplant process. So our physical health is important. Our emotional health is important. Our spiritual health is important. Our intellectual health and also our social health. We need to pay attention to our holistic health. Many times we're just tempted to focus on one of these things and we wonder why we're still not thriving as individuals. But this will set up the rest of the challenges and tips that we talk about, but that we are 5-fold human beings and we all have needs and challenges and skills that fit into each of these 5 categories. And so these 5 categories will kind of give us an outline for the different family issues that we look at.
So the first one we're going to discuss are the physical health challenges and tips. This was something that was definitely a struggle for me through all of these areas throughout the transplant process. I think as moms, we often tend to, think about ourselves last, but we know as it says at the bottom, you can't pour out of an empty cup. So consistent nutrition for parents. One of the things that a family did for us when we were in a long-term hospitalization with Micah, even before transplant, was that they gave us meal vouchers. That's just Children's Hospital Pittsburgh does it with these pink ones, but you can get a guest tray brought to your room. And that was really helpful for us because it allowed me to get food in the room when I often wasn't willing to leave to eat. We provide healthy snacks for families because that's another way that you can forget about nutrition and you need to be able to eat. Getting exercise. So like a lot of Ronald McDonald houses have gyms or different fitness equipment that you can utilize to kind of burn off some steam and stay moving and active, which we know is good for our mental health as well. Sleep was, I always say, sleep and a hospital is an oxymoron. Like they just don't coexist. And after a month of trying to sleep on the hospital, pull out vinyl thing, I eventually just moved in and brought in memory foam and flannel sheets and made myself a bed. But trying to have things like a sleep mask, earplugs, things like that are helpful for meeting the physical needs and things that we in turn provide through our nonprofit now as well. They might seem laughable to other people, but I think people who have experienced things like most of us have realized the importance of utilizing those things. So taking care of ourselves so that we in turn can pour out to take care of our children.
And we'll talk a little bit later about how we address some of these physical needs through our nonprofit Pressing On. And you can learn more about Pressing On's programs at pressingon.org. But part of our physical nature is also the financial challenges that we have, the financial stress of those healthcare bills and insurance and FMLA that we talked about. One of the things that we were a little skeptical towards as we listed our daughter for transplant is we were like, we've got good people around us, good jobs, good insurance. We felt like we had a good support system. Maybe we'll just try to tackle this on our own. And we necessarily weren't thinking about fundraisers, but they really came into to play in a heavy way during Micah's transplant.
Yeah, we went ahead with CODA, which is the Children's Organ Transplant Association and one of the sponsors of the conference. We love CODA dearly and learned that the expenses that were going to surround transplant were not just the medical bills. We were going to be eating out 3 times a day when we were in the hospital. There were gas costs, transportation costs. Many families we meet fly in. So there was this living away from home situation. So CODA is a wonderful organization that's also a nonprofit. So all of the gifts given are tax exempt and definitely worth checking out. Don't let it scare you away that there are fundraisers involved and things. They are so wonderful at coming alongside you and helping you that, and it's for their lifetime. We still expense monthly things to CODA 5 years after transplant. So it's a wonderful organization that you need to definitely check out if you're in that process and even after. So another one is the American Transplant Foundation. They have a patient assistance program. There's a National Living Donor Assistance Center, and the Donor Alliance is wonderful. If you go to donoralliance.org and search financial assistance, there's CODA is on that list, all of the different financial resources. I would advise to be careful with GoFundMe. Just a tip that we have, they do take a cut of it. So it seems, great and it's easy to set up for people, but they do take a cut, whereas other places that are nonprofits and tax exempt don't. You get all of the funds given for your child. And then, of course, discuss with your employer's HR department for information on things like FMLA, even repeatedly for monthly labs. You can have that FMLA put in place to be excused for appointments and labs and clinics and things like that.
And as much as it might be painful to constantly revisit your finances before, during, and after transplant, we'd recommend it. It's very important. Just like you don't set a budget for your personal life and your family and never revisit it. We'd encourage you to look into fundraising before. We'd encourage you to take a look at the FMLA options that you might have and getting insurance approval during, and then checking up on insurance and claims afterwards. I remember the year that our daughter was transplanted, our explanation of benefits was over $2 million. And I went in, every couple months just to take a look at the claims and see what was happening. It's not the most fun process, but it is helpful for you to stay on top of your finances before, during, and after transplant. So moving on from physical and financial to emotional, this is something that was hard for me as a dad at first, but it's really important that we pay attention to our feelings. That may sound like a weak phrase, but we actually believe that it's wise and strong. We believe that everything comes from something, that a feeling of anger or a feeling of bitterness or a feeling of pride or whatever it is, it comes from somewhere. That whether it's a relationship or a conversation or a life circumstance, to really process through where that's coming from will help us gain solutions to the emotional challenges that we face. And like it or not, the emotions swing up and down, just like the roller coaster that we talked about. But there is an ongoing emotional weight of medical trauma when you approach transplant.
So I often tell people that it's wise and it's strong to see a therapist, and yet I was not doing so myself for a very long time. And I'm very grateful that I have found a wonderful therapist now who specializes in trauma. And one of the books he recommended for me to read is called The Body Keeps the Score. I highly recommend it. It's kind of technical. It's not a fast read, but it has really helped me give myself grace when I often struggle with anxiety or I have a panic attack. I can be hard on myself and say, we are 5 years post-transplant. Everything's fine. I should be fine. And understanding that trauma is stored somewhere in my body has helped me give myself the grace to allow it to happen and to work through it. So highly recommend that, just saying that it is wise to not just carry that emotional burden, because that's a stress then that you can take out on your spouse or your kids. And so dealing with the root of that and understanding that in turn helps you as a family in persevering through that process.
And maybe there's some parents out there or guardians or caregivers that just simply need to hear that seeking therapy is not weak. It's wise. We don't want you to carry that emotional burden, that heaviness of the trauma and hospitalization of transplant alone. And so seeking counseling and therapy and talking to your social worker and the transplant psychologist that are provided to you is super, super helpful. So those are a few emotional things that we would recommend. And regardless of whether you consider yourself a religious person or not, I think that we all would agree that we all have a belief system or core values per se that we live our lives with. And many of those are challenged when we go through the transplant process. And so a question to keep in mind is, what personal beliefs of yours have been challenged during this medical journey? Maybe you want to talk through those things with a trusted friend, but we're not only physical and emotional, but we're spiritual beings as well. Maybe if you're a religious person, you might want to talk and pray through that with a trusted advisor or somebody that you consider a spiritual mentor or a pastor or priest. And many hospitals provide hospital chaplains that will cater to whatever your faith background is. It's really, really helpful to talk through those personal beliefs that you have that might be challenged. And maybe consider joining a community of faith for spiritual support, prayer, and also community. I know our church was extremely encouraging to Regan and I throughout the transplant process, just people checking in on us, texting us encouragement, following up with us after we got home, maybe bringing some meals, but allow others to encourage you spiritually. It's a dynamic that, the solution to spiritual health is not to just slap a wise saying or a Bible verse on the situation and say, oh, well, I have faith, so now everything's great. That's not what we're trying to say at all. You can have lots of questions, in the midst of a healthcare situation and still have faith. And so just remember that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest flame. That's a shameless plug for the city of Pittsburgh, the steel city where we live. But it's one of the things that we believe in, is that you are gaining character and integrity, and you're being strengthened through your medical crisis in ways that you could never be strengthened otherwise. And so keep in mind your spiritual health as well when you go through the transplant process.
So another aspect of holistic health is the intellectual component. So the intellectual overwhelming amount of information, like I said, that we receive. And as parents, I kept thinking, like, I am not a doctor. And so I can get really overwhelmed with the information. So we would say, write down as many details, questions, and concerns as possible. We give like a notebook and we keep that with us, because you think of everything when rounds are over or when the doctor walks out of the room. So trying to remember those things and writing them down is very helpful. Being completely okay with asking for clarity. So many of the groups that I've been a part of since transplant, where doctors are so humbly asking for our feedback, which is wonderful, is, making sure that they know that they need to be receptive to parent questions and saying, please just help me understand that. Or could you just repeat that for me? Don't be afraid to ask those questions. You know your child the best, and you are their most wonderful advocate. So being okay with asking for clarity is so important.
And definitely seek out experiential knowledge, none that trumps or conflicts with what the doctor is recommending for you. But it is helpful to know other people that are walking a similar path to the one that you're walking. And so join a group like Transplant Families or the Organic Acidemia Association or Pressing On that we run. There's so many great places out there for you to link up with other families that are going through similar things so that you can learn from their experience. And then lastly, the fifth element of us as human beings that we want to talk through health challenges and tips is the relational component, or the social component, because we know that trusted relationships are key to persevering through the transplant process. And I think that, it may sound silly, but not every relationship that you have is life-giving. Some relationships suck the life right out of you. And so I think that we all know that person in our life that, is that EGR, that extra grace required person that you don't necessarily love interacting with. And just a tip, if you can't find somebody in your life that's EGR, it might be you for somebody else. So we all need to be humble in the sense that we probably, rub people wrong at times as well. But trusted relationships are key. And we want you to identify those people that are life-giving to you. And we want you to lean into them very, very heavily during the transplant process. One thing that we were not prepared for is that there's going to be people that don't come with you on this journey. Prepare yourself to gain friends, but also prepare yourself to lose friends. And those that get it may surprise you. There were so many people that really surprised us. It's like, wow, they're coming along on this journey. They're supporting us. They're encouraging us. They're checking in on us. And other people that the healthcare field, the trauma of the hospital was just too much for them. And people that you think that you might be close to might fall out of your life for a season. And that's okay. Life is filled with seasons, but our need for community is greatest during the trials of life. We're most vulnerable as humans when we're isolated. And we just want to encourage you, especially during the transplant process, we need one another. And so visit with a friend at the hospital, check in on them. Don't expect anything from the person that you're checking in, but let them know that they're seen, that they're loved, that they're valued, that they're cared for. And so lastly, just don't travel the transplant journey alone. We say all the time in our conversations with Pressing On families that we may not be able to change the pain in someone's path, but we can change the strength by their side. And so let us ask you the question, who can you be that for during this season of life? Who can you strengthen someone by their side, not solve their problem, not take away the healthcare trauma, but whose side can you strengthen?
Yeah. One question came in, and we're going to wait till the end to discuss most of the questions, but one that I do want to discuss right now because it applies to this was, what do you do when someone in your immediate family is the extra grace required? And, that's where boundaries come into place.
Absolutely.
You don't have to treat them unkindly. You don't have to completely, remove them from your life, because you can't. They're part of your family and your immediate family. But having those boundaries where you say, I can only do this, and then beyond that, that's not healthy for me. Being able to put those boundaries into place and to kind of identify those areas that are again are life-giving to you and that are going to make things worse, and being able to stick to those boundaries is my tip on that. But we'll get to the rest of the questions at the end, but I just wanted to address that since it was part of this.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm passionate about is communication, and not just public communication, but intentional interpersonal communication with how we interact with one another. And so we want to share a few things that we chose to do during transplant that we feel like benefited things.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been on this journey and you have enough well-meaning people in your life, you know that the texts and the emails and the phone calls and the social media posts can be overwhelming, that it's hard to really get to everybody, even when you want to update them on your child.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's first start with communication with your partner or your spouse or that person that you love so dearly. Let us encourage you to just be open and honest and sacrificial and compassionate. Be willing to let one another grieve in a very specific way that might be different from the way that you're grieving.
Yeah.
Give one another the space that you need to process all that's going on this transplant journey, because it's a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think we processed that, of course we processed it differently, but, for me in the month after transplant, I definitely cried hysterically multiple times a day.
True.
He didn't, it was like every time I saw Micah still on the ventilator another day, and she almost had to be relisted for transplant the week after. She became very addicted to the painkillers. I cried all the time. Like that was my baby, and seeing her like that, I cried all the time. Richie didn't. I truly think, let's see how I'm communicating in the midst of this. I think it's hit you more later. It's hit you more later in different ways. And so communicating about that and helping me understand that maybe some frustration even now is still, being processed from that. Whereas maybe I've sighed more of a sigh of relief, afterwards, but I was a basket case.
And I think it's important for us to recognize as individuals how we battle trauma. And I think that there's like a flight, flee type of, scenario there that when I'm faced with trauma, I just naturally jump in and I fight. I'm like, what can I do to improve this situation? Yeah. It's like that fight or flight, scenario. I think for us to just identify, here's how I naturally approach trauma, specifically related to hospitalization and transplant.
Yeah, totally.
And it's not going to solve the other person's, problem necessarily, but at least we'll have a better understanding of ourselves. And so real quickly with communication, share age appropriate information with your other children, with the siblings of the patient. It's really important to bring them along for the ride. We always felt blessed when someone would ask us about Olivia during the transplant process. Even though Micah's the patient, she's the big sister. How is Olivia handling all of this?
Absolutely.
Can I take Olivia out for ice cream tomorrow night when you guys are at the hospital?
She got so much ice cream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Regan was speaking about this a little bit earlier too. Communication with extended family, to recognize your personal boundaries. If you feel the need to communicate with every single person in your family all the time during the transplant journey, let us just be the ones to kind of tell you it's going to be impossible.
Yeah.
And
I'm such a people pleaser. So I wanted to make sure everyone knew and everyone had everything. But like this says, copy and paste is your friend. I was just talking about the personal boundaries. One of those is I can't keep everyone happy and possibly take care of myself while I'm trying to take care of a very sick child. So, honestly, though, like once you kind of write that response, copy and paste truly is your friend. And then with friends and social media, Richie is a communications major. So that definitely worked in my favor. But he had the care page set up, and through CODA, they have care pages, and journal types of things where you can write it once and then people know, and then you can blast that on.
And one way to establish a boundary is not only, to type 3 or 4 sentences of the daily update or here's what happened this morning and copy and paste to your your loved ones that you want to know on an hourly basis, but to also tell people, hey, we're going to try to update the care page every other day, in the evening. So look for that. That way people aren't blasting you all the time with the text. They know whether it's, hey, we're going to update the care page every evening or whatnot. One of the questions that came through is, how do you make time for your marriage when everyone's afraid to watch your kids? That is a tough one. I think that this may sound like an oversimplistic answer, but you need to choose to make it a priority. If you're waiting around for your feelings to just be like, oh, wow, like I feel that love that I first have when we first started dating, and that attraction, like we're in the trenches of trauma here with transplant, and it's a daily choice. If we're going to wait until our feelings, kind of kick in, like, wow, I'm over the moon in love with this person. Like you're watching your child go through something really hard. And sometimes you're blaming one another, but you have to make a choice to prioritize certain relationships. And so we celebrated Valentine's Day in the hospital, and it was not like over the top or anything like that, but it was one of those choices that we made. Like, we're going to try to celebrate everything that we can and prioritize one another.
My sister graciously went out of her way. So that was super helpful too. But she got into cahoots with the nurses on the transplant floor, because at that point we'd been inpatient almost 2 months. And she surprised us with a Valentine's date in the conference room of the transplant unit. And we had sweatpants on and hadn't washed our hair in days, but we went anyways. And we had like a little candlelight dinner in the conference room of the hospital. And it's, bittersweet. Those moments are bittersweet, but trying to find really small ways here and there, especially when you're in the trenches like that, is important. And what happens when your partner shuts down and is struggling? Just to answer that before we turn this over to Beth, is, I think it's the little ways that you stick with someone, that's what, love truly means, is when it's a choice. It's definitely not a feeling, especially during those times of, when you see someone shutting down. It's really hard. And that's when you encourage them to get the help that they need, to take the time that they need to make sure that they care for themselves and seek the support that they need as well.
And to be able to process in their own way, to ask open-ended questions that simply like, how did this make you feel today? Or when the doctor shared this morning, how did you process that? What do you think our next steps are? To really kind of put the ball in someone else's court, not to shove answers down their throat, allow them to feel the things they need to feel. But overall, kind of summarizing that communication in family and marriage, I think that many times our feelings are going to be sorrowful and grieving during the transplant process, but our feelings are fickle. And so many times we need to choose to prioritize the other relationships in our life that we love and care for. And many times our feelings will catch up with our actions. You may not necessarily feel it all the time, but
it's like exercising, which I don't do much of, but you do. So I'll pretend I know about it. I think it's like you don't feel like doing it, but you're always glad you do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple more questions that we'll hit towards the end. We want to turn it over to our friend, Dr. Beth Logan.
So I'm going to just briefly introduce Dr. Beth Logan. She is the pediatric psychologist at the transplant psychologist currently at Boston Children's, but we were so blessed to have Beth as part of our transplant journey when she used to be in Pittsburgh. And she does an excellent job of caring for the whole family and being aware of how the transplant process affects not just the patient, but the parents and their relationships and the siblings. So Beth, thanks for joining us. We'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Richie and Regan. And I will say I'm so honored to be a part of today's talk. Richie and Regan, what a beautiful summary of the challenges facing families during this time. And I was asked to speak a little bit to some tips and tricks for families who are co-parenting during the transplant process, because every family is unique as they navigate this journey. And so Regan, I'll ask you to, awesome. So what do we know as we navigate this process is that families are remarkably important as patients navigate this journey. Families take on lots of different roles. They help patients do the specific tasks that they need to do as they navigate their care. They help motivate them and influence behavior change. They help them make decisions that are important to their care. They help them cope with their symptoms. They help them cope with stress. They help them access resources. They help support them into and the new role that their illness has impacted them, and they help them manage appointments and all of the other necessary things that they need to do. And we know that families then, all of this leads to increased social support, which then impacts the patient's mental health, their adjustment to illness, which then leads them to take better care of themselves, and then hopefully in the long term actually results in better health outcomes. But what we do know is that there is no one size fits all. There's no one way to navigate this. And so sometimes I like to talk about transplant as being a journey, and this journey is a winding road. And so I really like this picture here on the left. As we think about taking off down this transplant journey, there are lessons ahead. This journey goes on forever, right? There's no end in sight. It's not like we're going from point A to point B. It's a journey that we continue to travel for the rest of our lives. It can often feel like we're driving in the dark without some real signs to help us know where we're going. And what we know is that all families are different, right? Families come in all different shapes and sizes. Family compositions are different. And in many cases, there are multiple caregivers who are responsible for taking care of a patient, right? Sometimes it's two parents in one household. Sometimes it's families where caregivers are divorced or separated. And oftentimes, caregivers don't always agree on every decision, particularly some of the more complicated healthcare decisions. And so what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is how can parents come together to effectively co-parent around a child's medical care? And so let's start at the beginning of this journey. Let's jump right in and let's think about how do we set a foundation before there are disagreements in care? How do we set ourselves up for success? And so the first thing to do is to really think about what do we need to accomplish on a daily or a weekly basis to provide for our child's care? And how do we sit down as partners in our child's care to agree upon a routine that promotes our child's health? And so oftentimes some of the basics are things like, what is the medication schedule that our child is going to need to adhere to? And this is often something that the medical team can help with. We know that there are certain medications that need to be taken at certain times of day. But oftentimes there are also health routines that are part of this as well. So we should make decisions about things like who is going to refill the medications, who is going to take our child for labs, who is going to take our child for routine appointments, who's going to communicate with the school nurse, who is going to communicate with the pharmacist. If our child has other specialists involved in their care, who is going to communicate with those providers? And all of these things can be agreed upon in advance. The more that co-parents can sit down and make a plan about some of these things in advance, the better. There are lots of kind of cool tips and tricks that parents have shared with me along the way that they've used. So there are lots of apps out there now that parents use to kind of keep track of this stuff. Some parents use a joint email address where everybody sends an email to the joint email address to keep track of appointments and things, or use a joint calendar so that everything is kind of collated together. Another thing that's really important to do just to manage kind of foundational things is to set behavioral expectations for your child around care. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody does everything exactly the same. That doesn't even happen when two parents are in the same household. But it does mean that we should try to keep things as consistent as we can. So if we think about, for example, how a child takes medication, we want to avoid things like in one household, a child takes medication within a span of 5 minutes, whereas in another household, the child takes medication over the span of an hour. So we want to do as much as we can to try to make routines that are going to exist in both households look as similar as we possibly can. Similarly, when we think about appointments and hospitalizations, we want to think about what can we do to create some structure that everybody can follow. So just like Regan and Richie were saying, as much as you can, make a list of questions for providers in advance. What are the things that we're hoping to cover when we go to an appointment? What are the questions that everybody has? What are the things that we anticipate we may have a disagreement about that we're hoping to get some input about from a medical provider? And can we make a list of those things so that we can make sure that we discuss it with the team while we're at our visit? Take notes while you're in the appointment. Write down important information, particularly if your co-parent is not going to be able to be at that visit with you. Then you have a log of the important information that you can share with them after the visit. And particularly if you're concerned about miscommunication, you can ask your child's treatment team to provide either an after-visit summary or written recommendations for you to share with the other parent. And this is becoming increasingly common in healthcare now anyway. A lot of the visit notes and after-visit summaries are now part of the patient portals that typically both parents can have access to after the visits. So even sometimes when we set a good foundation, we oftentimes hit communication roadblocks. And I want to talk through a couple of common examples that that I commonly encounter in my practice. So let's think about this first example, and this is one that I'm sure parents have seen a lot of in the last couple of years. So child comes home and says, "Hey parent, I want to go to a sleepover in the middle of a pandemic." And parent one says, "No way. The pandemic presents too much risk. You'll get sick." So in other words, I'm concerned about our child's safety. I don't want them to go. Parent two says, "They're isolated. They haven't seen anybody. I'm worried about them." So in other words, I'm concerned about our child's emotional well-being. You can see how in this situation, both parents really feel like they're right. Both parents may really feel like their point is more important. Both parents may really feel like they're making a decision that is in their child's best interest. Similarly, if you think about this second example, where parents may be considering starting a medication to treat a child's emotional symptoms. This is one I encounter pretty frequently in my practice. Where parent one may say, "I'm concerned that this medication may impact other areas of our child's development, such as growth, or I'm concerned about medication safety. And so, in other words, I'm concerned about our child's safety." Parent two says, "I'm concerned that left untreated, these emotional symptoms may pose a risk to our child in another way. So, in other words, I'm concerned about our child's emotional well-being." And again, we're at a stalemate. And you can see again how it would be difficult for either parent to budge in this situation, because both parents again feel like they would be making a decision that is in their child's best interest, and both feel like each of their points is important. And you can see how pretty quickly each of these situations could make it feel like we're at an impasse. In these situations, oftentimes, parents will come to myself as a psychologist or other members of the team and say, "We want you to tell us who's right." And part of the challenge in these situations is that both parents are right? Each person in this situation is a little bit right. And so what we're stuck with in this situation is what we refer to as a decisional balance, right? We have to look at how each parent is weighing the priorities in the situation against each other. And this is where your team can be helpful. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how do we get unstuck when we hit a roadblock. And so first and foremost, we always want to keep your child's best interest at the forefront of your mind, keeping in mind, again, that these decisional balances may be complex. It's not that one parent or the other is not keeping a child's best interest at the forefront of their mind. It's that they're weighing the priorities a little bit differently. And so we want to gather as much information as we can. So we can ask our child's medical team for input and say, what are the medical factors that we want to take into account here? We can go to our child and ask our child for input. And I want to add here, very importantly, that this is not asking our child to be a tiebreaker in this situation. This is not putting the burden of the decision on the child to make this decision. This is not making the child the decision maker, but this is recognizing that the child does have a voice in the decision and a perspective to be shared and considered in making a complicated decision. And then once we gather as much information as we can, we want to set a time for grown-ups to discuss this decision. And if there is a disagreement to be had, we want to make sure that this disagreement is happening away from the child. Children are often quick to internalize disagreements between co-parents as being their fault. And so as much as we can, we want to make sure that any disagreements are happening out of earshot of our child. And then once we come to a decision point, we want to present it to the child, and we want to resist blaming one parent or the other for whatever the decision is. We want to present our unified front and say, you know, parent one and parent two made this decision together. We made this decision considering all of these points, and we made this decision in your best interest. This is tough. And so again, we want to really lean on our support system to help support us through this process. So yeah, you know, use your family and friends to help you through this process. They really can help and provide support. Seek support from other transplant families. You know, organizations are phenomenal in supporting each other. I know even, you know, for myself as a professional, I learned so much from working with these organizations and with all of you as a community. You're such a wonderful support to each other. And so, you know, access each other for support, figure out how other families have navigated similar concerns. Ask at your center for social work and or psychology support. We can help tailor services for your family. Again, these decisional balances are different, and we would want to make these decisions in an individualized way, specific to your child and specific to your family. You know, the thing that I love most about working with transplant families is that all of the work that we do is very, very multidisciplinary. You know, we work together as a team to really think about, you know, for this child and for this family, how do we make this one specific decision? And we all have a voice on the team, including your child and including all members of your family, to think about what are the complex factors that help us decide how we make this decision. And, you know, while you as a family, as, you know, as two co-parents may be thinking about, you know, maybe feel like you're at a bit of an impasse with these conversations, you know, we have these kinds of conversations as a team on a regular basis, and we can help you kind of gain some perspective and think about some of the other factors that may be at play. I know others have mentioned it, and I'll make a plug for seeking therapy support as well. You know, if you've ever considered seeking therapy for yourself, for your child who's had a transplant, or for a sibling, I would encourage you to do it. I think a lot of times people think that symptoms have to reach a certain threshold in order to say that a child needs therapy. But I would really challenge that. And because a lot of what we do as psychologists is really to think about what are the things that your child and your family do well, and how do we build on that, and how do we build resiliency to help you in the face of challenges. And so therapy can be really helpful, even if your child doesn't, you know, reach a threshold of a diagnosis, to say, how do we just help you cope in the face of challenges? And so it can be really helpful as you're facing a chronic illness, to think about how do you have more support as you go through it. And as you're thinking about how do I access therapy, particularly with the mental health crisis being what it is in this country, I would encourage you to first ask at your child's transplant center for any recommendations for therapy support. But other good places to ask are at your child's pediatrician's office. You can also call your child's insurance carrier and ask for recommendations. And your schools oftentimes maintain a list of providers that may be accepting referrals. And last but not least, if you feel like your family situation truly is beyond the supports that you've already accessed, you can also consider consulting with a family attorney to review the parenting agreement that you may have in place. It's hard to give some specific tips and tricks around this because laws do vary pretty widely by state, but family attorneys are well versed in this and can provide consultation. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Regan and Richie to talk a little bit more about Pressing On and the work that they do within the organization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Logan. Those principles, regardless of what your family makeup looks like or where you're at in the transplant process, are super helpful. I know I'm going to go back and review a lot of that as well. So thank you for sharing all of that insight. You know, we say all the time in our organization at pressingon.org that we desire to meet tangible needs in order to meet intangible needs long term. We desire a relationship with families that are going through long-term hospitalizations, specifically in the transplant process. So, Regan, in conclusion, maybe you can share a few of the programs that we have going on with Pressing On.
I know we're running out of time, so I will just brief over these so we can have time for these last couple questions. But please check out our website at pressingon.org. We provide free hospital care packages for families all over the country. We ship them. We drop them off in local hospitals with lots of the things that we've mentioned, like sleep aids and snacks and water bottles and notepads to help you. We have a gas card program for the Pittsburgh area families to help with that transportation cost. We do crisis coaching where Richie and I and some of our volunteers are just a sounding board for parents of hospitalized children. We do meal vouchers at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh as well. And please check out our website. We have hospital packing lists, Ronald McDonald House packing list, and music playlist because we know what it's like to be in a waiting room for a very long time as well.
And just having started the organization a few short years ago, we're blessed to be able to report that we've already served over 1,000 families. And so don't think that we don't have time for you. Yeah. We would love to connect with you personally, and you can take advantage of all of these resources and programs. They're all free on our website at pressingon.org. Here's just a little reflection of the states that we've shipped care packages to over the last year. And so don't think that if you're not in the Pittsburgh area that our organization can't provide you with free resources on your transplant journey. We would absolutely love to come alongside of you, provide some resources that are going to help you holistically, like we talked about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, there's hospital packing lists on our website that include for planned hospitalizations, emergency room trips, and the Ronald McDonald House. There are playlists. We call them tunes for tough times, like every genre of music just to listen to. So that's just a snapshot kind of what we do, and know that you're not alone. You're seen, valued, and loved. We truly mean that. And we know that we are all better together in persevering through the transplant journey. So we're honored that we were able to share today. We're going to hit a few of these questions that are left in the side. If there's any more, send them our way. One that we see is, what about well-meaning family and friends who never seem to understand the check the care page thing? I guess my advice would just be to set a boundary with that person. You can't call them 4 times a day for an update, but maybe you can say, you could call Aunt Betty, who does have social media and sees the care page, for an update, or I could call you, every other day or something like that. You have to have some sort of boundary in place. Do you want to answer this, or should we send it to Beth? Last one.
What happens when your partner says they can't anymore, when divorce happens? How to carry forward that changed relationship? Yeah, I think that hits on what Beth was talking about regarding when you need to seek advice from others outside your family. I think that, no matter the relationship, whether it's a fractured relationship or a person that you're divorced with now, we want to interact with others with respect and dignity. And relationships are a two-way street, right? We like to think that marriage is 50-50, but it's really 100-100. Two people going 100% after the other. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work in our society. to treat others with dignity and respect, regardless of the previous fractured relationship, because your love for the child that you're caring for trumps that. And so there's no easy solutions or no magic button that you can just press to make that communication work. But if both people are seeking to make it work, I think that that's important. Let's see here.
I think we are about out of time. Yeah, I guess one last thing really to say is if you're in a place where you truly are not safe in an abusive relationship, it's very important to find a safe place to seek the help that you need for the sake of yourself and your child. So, that's a boundary that maybe people think goes without saying, but needs to be said. Mm-hmm. If you're in a place that's not safe or in danger, please seek help, right away, and don't hesitate.
So in conclusion, we just want to thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you found something during this presentation that was helpful during your transplant process. And, it's our goal that you would just simply join in with other transplant families that are pressing on. We want you to know that you're not alone, and we're here to serve you at pressingon.org. So thanks for having us today.
Thank you.